The male loneliness epidemic is a term that has moved from the fringes of internet forums into the mainstream of sociology and public health. To describe this phenomenon as a form of solitary confinement is not mere hyperbole. It is a precise psychological comparison. Solitary confinement in prisons is designed to break the spirit by removing the social mirror, the feedback we get from others that confirms our existence and value. For millions of men in the modern era, the walls of this confinement are not made of concrete, but of digital isolation, shifting social norms, and the collapse of traditional third places. The architecture of the cell. Why men are receding. The comparison to solitary confinement holds because for many men, the isolation is not a choice, but a structural byproduct of 21st century life. Historically, men's social lives were tethered to physical labor, civic organizations, lodges, unions, and local watering holes. As these have vanished, replaced by remote work and algorithmic entertainment, the tribal nature of male bonding has been digitized and diluted. In a literal prison, a man in solitary loses his sense of time and self. In the social solitary of the modern world, a man loses his sense of utility. If no one needs his protection, his provision, or his presence, the masculine psyche begins to atrophy. He exists in a vacuum where his efforts go unobserved and his struggles go unvoiced. The silent component, the lack of emotional literacy. What makes this confinement particularly brutal is the code of silence that often accompanies it. Unlike women, who generally have more robust social scaffolding for emotional sharing, men are often socialized to view vulnerability as a liability. When a man feels the walls closing in, he often lacks the tools to signal for help. He is trapped in a room where the door isn't locked from the outside, but he has forgotten how to turn the handle. This leads to a feedback loop. Isolation breeds social anxiety, which makes future social interaction feel more threatening, further tightening the solitary nature of his existence. The biological cost, the body in isolation. The brain processes social rejection and chronic loneliness using the same neural pathways as physical pain. In solitary confinement, inmates often experience social death, a state where they stop caring about their hygiene, their future, or their survival. We see this reflected in the male loneliness epidemic through skyrocketing rates of deaths of despair, overdose and suicide, and a general withdrawal from the milestones of adulthood, such as career advancement or starting a family. When you are in a cell, why bother decorating the walls? If a man feels he is effectively invisible to the world, specifically to the job market and the dating pool, he stops participating in the social contract entirely. The digital paradox, a window, not a door. The internet acts as the observation slit in the cell door. It allows the lonely man to watch the world, but not to touch it. Social media provides a looks match or success match gallery that often reinforces his sense of inadequacy. He sees the winners of the social game, which only serves to remind him of the thickness of his own invisible walls. Furthermore, the digitization of intimacy, via pornography or AI companions, acts as a nutritional supplement that prevents immediate starvation, but offers no actual sustenance. It keeps the man in his cell by providing a low-effort substitute for the very thing that would set him free: genuine, messy human connection. Conclusion: breaking the confinement. If the male loneliness epidemic is indeed a form of solitary confinement, the cure cannot be found in more screens or better apps. It requires a radical return to the physical world. It requires the rebuilding of male-specific spaces where utility and camaraderie are the currency. To end the confinement, society must recognize that a man's worth is not a static score determined by a hiring manager or a dating algorithm, but a dynamic quality built through action and community. Until men are encouraged to step out of the digital shadow and back into the arena of physical communal life, the walls of this silent prison will only grow thicker.
There is a specific form of torture that civilized societies have largely agreed to condemn. Solitary confinement, the isolation of a human being in a small space, cut off from meaningful contact with other people, is recognized by psychologists, psychiatrists, and human rights organizations as profoundly damaging to mental health. Studies on prisoners held in solitary show rapid deterioration, anxiety, depression, hallucinations, cognitive decline, a destabilization of the sense of self that can become permanent. The United Nations has called prolonged solitary confinement a form of torture. What happens when you remove the bars but keep everything else? The invisible cell. Millions of men in the modern West are living in a condition that replicates the psychological structure of solitary confinement with remarkable precision. Without the physical walls, without the legal sentence, and without any social recognition that something is being done to them. They have apartments instead of cells. They have screens instead of walls. They have the theoretical freedom to go anywhere, and nowhere meaningful to go. They have the legal right to speak to anyone, and no one who is genuinely listening. The research is unambiguous. Men report having fewer close friends than at any point in recorded modern history. The number of men reporting zero close friendships has increased fivefold since 1990. A significant percentage of men report that their only source of emotional support is their romantic partner, and a growing percentage have no romantic partner. When asked who they would turn to in a crisis, a substantial number of men cannot name a single person. This is not metaphorical isolation. This is clinical isolation, the kind that in a laboratory setting, applied to animals, would be considered cruel and unusual. What isolation does to a human being. The neuroscience of loneliness is now well established and consistently alarming. Chronic loneliness activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain processes social rejection in the same regions that process a broken bone. Sustained isolation elevates cortisol, the stress hormone, to levels associated with chronic disease. It suppresses immune function. It accelerates cognitive decline. It increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by approximately 30%. It shortens life expectancy by roughly as much as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Lonely people also enter a hypervigilant state. The nervous system, deprived of safe social connection, begins to treat the environment as threatening. Social situations that require trust become harder to navigate. The very skills needed to escape isolation atrophy through disuse. The isolated man becomes less able to connect precisely because he has been isolated, a feedback loop that tightens with every passing year. This is what solitary confinement does to prisoners. And it is what prolonged loneliness does to men living in studio apartments in cities where they know no one, working remotely, eating alone, watching other people's lives through a screen, and waking up the next morning to do it again. Loneliness affects everyone, but it affects men and women differently, for reasons that are structural, cultural, and psychological simultaneously. Women's friendships tend to be built on emotional disclosure, talking, sharing, processing. These friendships can be maintained through conversation alone, across distances, through text and phone calls. They are portable and resilient. Men's friendships tend to be built on shared activity, doing things together, side by side, in the same physical space. The friendship exists in the context of the activity, the sport, the job, the project, the regular gathering. Remove the activity and the friendship often dissolves, not because it wasn't real, but because it had no independent infrastructure. Modern life has systematically dismantled the spaces where male activity-based friendship occurred. Factories closed, military service became voluntary and rare. Bowling leagues, civic organizations, religious communities all collapsed. The third places where men gathered without agenda, the pub, the barbershop, the social club, have thinned out or been replaced by consumption experiences that don't generate connection. What replaced them? Remote work? Streaming services, delivery apps. A world optimized for individual convenience at the cost of collective ritual. Men lost the scaffolding their friendships depended on, and unlike women, most men were not equipped with the skills to rebuild those friendships on a different foundation. The confession problem. There is a further layer that makes male loneliness uniquely self-perpetuating. To escape loneliness, you have to acknowledge it. To acknowledge it, you have to be willing to be vulnerable about it. To say to someone, I am lonely, I am struggling, I need connection. This confession is the necessary first step toward any repair. For men, this confession is extraordinarily difficult, not because men are constitutionally incapable of vulnerability, but because the social consequences of that vulnerability have historically been severe. Men who admit weakness are perceived as less competent, less attractive, less trustworthy as leaders and partners. The perception may be unfair, But it is real, documented in research and internalized by men from an early age. So the lonely man does not say he is lonely. He says he is fine. He performs competence and self-sufficiency. He watches the connection he needs recede further and performs more convincingly that he doesn't need it. The prisoner in solitary at least knows he is in solitary. The lonely man has often convinced himself, as part of the same survival mechanism, that he is simply independent.
The man in prolonged isolation does not simply fade quietly. He looks for meaning, identity, and belonging wherever the algorithm points him. And the algorithm, optimized for engagement rather than well-being, points him toward communities built on grievance, on rage, on the cold comfort of shared contempt. Radicalization is, at its root, a loneliness epidemic dressed in ideology. He self-medicates. Alcohol, opioids, pornography, gambling, all are more prevalent among isolated men. All are cheaper, more accessible, and more immediately rewarding than the slow and uncertain work of building genuine connection. He dies earlier. He dies by suicide at 4 times the rate of women. He dies of the diseases that loneliness accelerates. He dies often without anyone noticing quickly. The undiscovered body in the apartment is almost always male. These are not statistics about personal failure. They are statistics about a structural condition that has been consistently undertreated, underfunded, and underacknowledged because the culture has not yet developed adequate language for male suffering that doesn't immediately dissolve into either dismissal or blame. What solitary confinement without bars requires. The recognition that male loneliness operates at the scale and intensity of solitary confinement should change what we demand in response. We do not tell prisoners in solitary to simply try harder to connect. We do not tell them that their isolation is a personal failing. We do not produce content telling them to work on themselves until they deserve company. We recognize that the condition itself, the structure of isolation, is the problem, and we address the structure. The male loneliness epidemic requires the same recognition. It requires the rebuilding of physical third places, spaces where men gather without agenda, where activity creates the conditions for friendship to form. It requires the rebuilding of male social skills, not as therapy for defective men, but as education for a generation that was never taught how to maintain friendships through the adult years. It requires the rebuilding of cultural permission, the slow, difficult work of making it acceptable for men to say I am struggling without losing everything they need to keep. And it requires the honest acknowledgement that what is happening to millions of men right now is not a lifestyle choice, not a character flaw, not a consequence of toxic masculinity that they deserve to sit with. It is a form of torture, administered without intent, without a torturer, without walls. And it is happening at a scale that no society can afford to ignore indefinitely. The cell is invisible, the damage is not.